to boring past times where history is told in quiet detail. Tonight, we wander through the forgotten reigns of medieval kings, rulers remembered not for greatness, but for failure. Their crowns were heavy, their choices disastrous, and their legacies long shadows across the centuries. As you listen, let the steady flow of history carry you into stillness and sleep. You have Story 1: King John of England, taxes, treachery, and the road to Magna Carta win. You think of King John of England, perhaps a certain image comes to mind: a greedy monarch, a cruel tyrant, and the villain of Robin Hood tales. Yet behind the legends lies a king whose reign was indeed filled with treachery, excessive taxation, and military disaster. But to understand John's failures, you must first step back into the England of the late 12th century, where dynastic struggles, foreign ambitions, and the ordinary burdens of medieval life all shaped the course of his troubled rule. The anxious childhood of a young Prince John was born in 1166, the youngest son of King Henry II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine. Being the youngest of several sons in a royal dynasty was no enviable position. His elder brothers, Henry, the young king, Richard, later known as the Lionheart, and Geoffrey were all ahead of him in the line of succession. To his father, John seemed almost an afterthought, and Henry II half-jokingly gave him the nickname Lackland, because, unlike his brothers, John had no territories or inheritances carved out for him. In the world of medieval monarchy, land was power, and without land, a prince was vulnerable. This lack of territory would haunt John for much of his life, fueling the envy and suspicion that would later characterize his reign. But while John's brothers received military training and were prepared for kingship, John grew up surrounded by the intricacies of court politics. He learned not the art of command, but the art of survival in a family that was perpetually at war with itself. His father and brothers clashed repeatedly, and his mother, Eleanor, supported rebellions against Henry II. In such a fractious family, John's role was never secure. The burden of the Plantagenet legacy. The Plantagenet dynasty into which John was born ruled not only England but also vast territories in France, including Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. This Angevin Empire, as historians sometimes call it, was less an empire and more a patchwork of loosely connected lands, tied together by fragile loyalty. Ruling it required a king who could balance diplomacy, military force, and financial control. John's elder brother, Richard I, remembered as the Lionheart, embodied the warrior king ideal. He led armies, went on crusade, and became legendary across Europe. But Richard's glory left John in his shadow, and when Richard was absent, especially during the Third Crusade, John often tried to seize power for himself, betraying his brother's trust. It was this habit of betrayal, combined with an insatiable hunger for power and money, that defined John long before he ever wore the crown. The unexpected path to the throne: when Richard died in 1199, the crown passed to John. Many in England were uncertain about him. He was not his father, who had ruled with authority and intelligence. He was not his brother, who had captured the imagination of Europe with military heroics. Instead, John was remembered for scheming and opportunism, and yet he inherited not only the throne of England, but also the enormous responsibility of defending the Angevin lands in France. Almost immediately, John faced challenges from rival claimants and rebellious nobles who doubted his ability to hold the empire together. Early missteps, marriage, nobles, and enemies. One of John's first political blunders came through marriage. In 1200, he set aside his first wife, Isabella of Gloucester, and married another Isabella of Angoulême. The problem was that Isabella had been betrothed to a powerful noble, Hugh de Lusignan. By snatching her away, John insulted an influential family, sparking a rebellion among the nobles of Poitou in western France. Rather than handle the situation with diplomacy, John reacted with arrogance. He humiliated his enemies, confiscated lands, and treated them with cruelty. In a feudal society built on delicate bonds of loyalty, this heavy-handedness alienated many of his vassals. The rebellion spread, and John soon found himself at war with the King of France, Philip II, who seized the opportunity to expand his influence at England's expense. This was the beginning of a series of conflicts that would cost John most of his French lands. The fall of Normandy, perhaps the most catastrophic failure of John's reign, was the loss of Normandy. This duchy had been central to the Plantagenet identity since William the Conqueror had crossed the Channel in 1066, but by 1204, through a mixture of military weakness and political mismanagement, John had lost Normandy to Philip II. The impact of this loss cannot be overstated. For the English nobility, many of whom held estates in both England and Normandy, the loss meant a painful division of their lands and loyalties. For John, it was a humiliation that stained his reputation permanently. And yet, instead of rallying his people with vision or leadership, John turned to the most resented tool in a medieval king's arsenal: taxation. Endless taxation and royal greed to fund his wars in France. John demanded money from his subjects at unprecedented levels. He levied scutage payments made by knights to avoid military service again and again, far beyond what was customary. He imposed fines, confiscated estates, and demanded payments for even routine royal favors. Ordinary people felt the weight of these demands as sheriffs squeezed peasants and towns for revenue. For nobles, John's greed was intolerable, especially when coupled with his arrogance and suspicion. He was quick to punish dissenters, sometimes seizing hostages or imprisoning their families. This atmosphere of fear and resentment grew steadily. Worse, eroding the trust that a medieval monarch depended upon to govern. The shadow of Tyrannius, the years passed. John's rule became increasingly tyrannical. Chroniclers describe him as vindictive, quick to anger, and endlessly suspicious of those around him. He quarreled with the church, leading to England being placed under papal interdicta, kind of spiritual punishment that suspended church services across the kingdom. For years, ordinary people were deprived of baptisms, marriages, and burials, performed under church authority. Meanwhile, John's relationship with his barons worsened. They were weary of endless taxation, humiliated by his military failures, and fearful of his cruelty. The gathering storm by 1214, John faced disaster at the Battle of Bouvines, where his attempt to recover lost French lands ended in crushing defeat. This was the final straw for many English barons. They began to organize against him, demanding that the king respect traditional rights and limit his arbitrary power. This growing resistance would lead within a year to a confrontation that changed English history forever: the sealing of the Magna Carta at Runnymede in 1215. But before we reach that pivotal moment, it is worth asking, how could a king who inherited such vast lands, such wealth, and such a legacy squander it all so completely? Was it merely John's character, or were there deeper forces at work in the shifting balance of medieval Europe? When you imagine medieval England, perhaps you think of castles, knights, and kings ruling with absolute power. Yet the reality was far less simple. A king could not rule alone. His authority depended on a network of loyalties, customs, and mutual obligations. By 1215, King John had so badly strained those bonds that rebellion was inevitable. The defeat at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214 was more than just another military setback. It was a humiliating collapse of John's last great hope to recover Normandy. John had spent enormous sums of money to build alliances, hiring mercenaries, and bribing continental nobles. For the English barons, many of whom had been compelled to fund the expedition through extraordinary taxes, the result was bitter. They had paid heavily for nothing. Normandy remained in French hands, and John's reputation as a capable king was shattered beyond repair. His barons, already weary of his demands, began to gather in opposition. Seeds of rebellion. The rebellion of 1215 was not a sudden eruption, but the product of years of tension. John's relentless taxation, his arbitrary seizures of land, his heavy fines, and his habit of holding noble hostages had created deep resentment. Among the barons, a sense of injustice grew. Feudal society rested on mutual obligations. Vassals provided loyalty and service, and in return, the king protected their rights and lands. But John's rule felt one-sided. He demanded everything, gave little, and punished harshly. Even the church, usually a stabilizing influence, had turned against him. Years earlier, John had quarreled with Pope Innocent III over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Pope had placed England under interdict, cutting off its people from the sacraments. Only after years of pressure did John submit, formally surrendering his kingdom to the Pope and receiving it back as a papal fief. To some nobles, this act was humiliating, a sign of weakness and desperation. By 1215, discontent had grown into open rebellion. The rebel barons take up arms. A group of disaffected nobles, later called the rebel barons, gathered under leaders such as Robert Fitzwalter. They demanded that John restore the ancient rights and customs of the kingdom. For them, this meant reaffirming the limits of royal power that had been established under earlier kings. In January 1215, the barons presented their demands to John, who refused to grant them. When negotiations failed, they renounced their allegiance and prepared for war. By May, London itself fell into rebel hands, giving them both symbolic strength and a secure base. John, faced with growing opposition and lacking the resources to crush them outright, was forced to negotiate. Runnymede, a meadow beside the Thames, June 1215. King and barons met at a riverside meadow called Runnymede, near Windsor. The choice of location was deliberate: open ground, neutral, but close to the royal stronghold of Windsor Castle. It was here that one of the most famous documents in English history would be sealed: the Magna Carta, or Great Charter. The Magna Carta, a charter of Limestad. Magna Carta was not, at first, a revolutionary manifesto of freedom. It was, in essence, a peace treaty between a king and his rebellious nobles. Its provisions focused heavily on baronial rights and feudal customs, yet within its clauses lay principles that would echo far beyond John's reign. Some of its most important articles included: the king could not impose arbitrary taxation without the consent of his council of barons. Free men could not be imprisoned or punished except by the lawful judgment of their peers or by the law of the land. Justice could not be sold, delayed, or denied. The Church of England was to remain free from royal interference. Even the king was bound by the law to modern eyes. These clauses appear monumental, but to the barons of 1215, they were practical safeguards against John's abuses. They sought not democracy, but stability and protection of their own privileges. John's reluctant seal on the 15th of June, 1215, John affixed his seal to the Magna Carta, yet he did so under duress. Contemporary accounts describe him as sullen, resentful, and unwilling. To him, the charter was not a solemn agreement, but a temporary humiliation, one he would undo at the first opportunity. Indeed, almost immediately after sealing it, John appealed to Pope Innocent III, claiming that the charter had been forced upon him unlawfully. The Pope, eager to protect the authority of kings and disliking baronial rebellion, annulled the Magna Carta within months. He declared it null and void, a shameful agreement forced by violence and fear. Civil war, the first barons' war with the annulment of Magna Carta, John threw England into civil war. The rebel barons refused to accept papal judgment and continued their resistance. They invited Prince Louis of France, son of King Philip II, to invade England and claim the throne. By 1216, England was a land divided. On one side stood King John and his loyalists. On the other stood the rebel barons, backed by foreign allies. Towns and castles across the realm shifted allegiance, some to John, others to Louis. For ordinary people, the war was devastating. Armies plundered villages, crops were destroyed, and trade was disrupted. For many peasants, the quarrel between king and barons meant only hardship and fear. John's final days' war raged. John's health and fortune declined. In October 1216, while traveling through eastern England, he contracted dysentery. Accounts describe him collapsing during a campaign, carried in a litter as his condition worsened. He died on the 18th of October, 1216, at the age of 49, and was buried in Worcester Cathedral. His death marked the end of one of the most troubled reigns in English history. His 9-year-old son, Henry III, inherited the throne. Under his regents, Magna Carta was reissued, this time with papal approval, becoming not just a failed peace treaty, but the foundation of English constitutional tradition. Magna Carta's enduring echo, though John himself despised the charter and never intended to honor it. His rebellion against his barons inadvertently gave birth to an idea far greater than himself, that even a king must be bound by law. For the men of 1215, Magna Carta was a safeguard of noble privilege, but in later centuries it would be invoked as a symbol of liberty, justice, and constitutional government. Its principles crossed oceans, shaping political thought in Britain, America, and beyond. And yet, even as Magna Carta's reputation grew, John himself remained remembered as a terrible king, greedy, cruel, and disastrously incompetent. But This raises a question. Was John truly the worst of kings, or was he simply the most unlucky, remembered not for his intentions, but for his failures? When John of England breathed his last in October of 1216, his reputation was already in ruins. Chroniclers who lived through his reign recorded him with contempt, calling him a faithless ruler, a tyrant, and a king who had lost more than he had ever gained. Yet history is rarely so simple. To fully understand John's legacy, you must look not only at his failures, but also at the consequences that rippled out from them, consequences that would shape English governance for centuries. The child king and the survival of the crown John left behind a realm fractured by civil war. The rebel barons had invited Prince Louis of France to take the throne, and much of England lay under foreign occupation. At such a moment, the crown itself seemed in jeopardy. Yet John's death unexpectedly changed the balance. His son, Henry III, was only 9 years old, a boy with no history of cruelty or misrule. Many barons who had turned against John found it easier to support a child king than to risk a French monarch ruling over them. In this sense, John's passing removed the central cause of rebellion, his own character. Henry's regents, notably William Marshal, quickly acted to stabilize the kingdom. They reissued Magna Carta in a revised form, trimming away the more radical demands, but keeping its essential promises. In doing so, they transformed the charter from a failed treaty into a living symbol of good governance. Thus, one of John's most enduring legacies was not something he achieved, but something that arose directly from his failure. How John was remembered by his contemporary scamperary. Chroniclers did not spare John in their accounts. Roger of Wendover described him as a tyrant rather than a king. Matthew Paris, writing a generation later, painted him in even darker tones: lecherous, cruel, suspicious, and ungodly. One story, perhaps exaggerated, tells of John starving a baron's wife and son to death in a royal prison. Another claims that he plotted to assassinate his nephew, Arthur of Brittany, the rightful heir to some Angevin lands. Though the details may have been shaped by rumor, the broader image was consistent. John as a king who inspired fear, not loyalty. Even the church remembered him with little fondness. His quarrel with the Pope had placed England under interdict for years, an act that left ordinary people without sacraments, though he eventually submitted to papal authority. His willingness to hand England over as a papal fief was seen by some as cowardice. The contrast with Richard and Henry II's reputation was worsened by comparison with his relatives. His father, Henry II, had been a capable administrator and lawgiver. His brother, Richard I, though absent from England for much of his reign, was immortalized as the Lionheart, a paragon of chivalric kingship. By contrast, John seemed small-minded, petty, and consumed by suspicion. Where Henry II inspired respect and Richard inspired admiration, John inspired resentment. His losses in France contrasted starkly with their achievements abroad, cementing his reputation as the weakest of the Plantagenets. John and the common people for the peasants and townspeople of England. John's reign was felt most directly through taxation. The endless demands for scutage, fines, and arbitrary levies strained households already living close to the edge of survival. Imagine a villager in early 3rd century England, already burdened with rents to a lord, labor obligations, and the uncertainty of harvests, to then face additional royal demands, often collected harshly by sheriffs, meant real hardship. For many, John was not a distant figure, but a daily weight pressing down on their livelihoods. At the same time, John's quarrel with the church left ordinary people spiritually adrift. Without regular sacraments, baptisms, marriages, and burials could not be performed with full church blessing. To medieval people, this was no small matter, but a disruption of the very order of life and death. The long shadow of Magna Carta, though John himself despised Magna Carta and sought to destroy it, his reign ensured its survival. Because it was reissued during Henry III's minority, it came to be seen not as a symbol of rebellion, but as a cornerstone of English governance. Over the centuries, its clauses would be invoked again and again, often reshaped to suit new political struggles. In the 17th century, opponents of the Stuart kings cited Magna Carta in their fight against absolute monarchy. In the 18th century, it influenced the American colonists who demanded no taxation without representation. In this way, John's unwilling signature on a meadow by the Thames became a foundational moment in the history of liberty. It is ironic, then, that one of history's most terrible kings helped create one of history's most celebrated documents. The question of luck versus character. Historians sometimes ask whether John was truly the worst of English kings, or whether he was simply the unluckiest. Certainly, he inherited enormous challenges. The loss of Normandy was already looming when Richard died, and Philip II of France was one of the most capable monarchs of the age. Yet John's character turned challenges into crises. His suspicion of his nobles, his cruelty toward opponents, his endless greed, and his inability to inspire loyalty made every setback worse. Other kings faced defeats and rebellions, but John seemed uniquely incapable of turning them into opportunities. Perhaps, then, it was not simply bad luck, but the combination of bad luck and bad character that sealed his reputation. Lessons from a failed reign for you, the listener. What is most striking about John's reign is not its drama, but its accumulation of wearying failures, a steady erosion of trust, a series of blunders that compounded one another. The grinding pressure of taxes, fines, and the slow alienation of every ally. These are not the marks of a king who ruled with vision or courage, but of one who ruled with fear and short-sightedness. In this sense, John's reign offers a lesson. Power without trust, authority without responsibility, and ambition without wisdom will always collapse in the end. The terrible king who changed history by the time John's body was lowered into Worcester Cathedral, few mourned him. His reign had been one of conflict, humiliation, and cruelty. Yet his failure gave rise to something far greater, the principle that even kings must answer to the law. This is the paradox of King John's legacy. He is remembered as one of the worst kings in English history, and yet his reign was a turning point. Out of his tyranny emerged a charter that echoed through the centuries, shaping the development of constitutional government around the world. And so we are left with a final reflection. If John had been a better king, more competent, more generous, more just, would Magna Carta ever have been written? Or was it only through the failures of a terrible ruler that the seeds of liberty were sown? Story 2. Charles VI of France, the mad king and the fragility of royal. But it was also a realm scarred by decades of war, rebellion, and financial strain. The 100 Years' War with England had already stretched for more than 40 years, draining treasure and blood. Peasant uprisings had shaken the countryside. The Black Death still lingered in memory, and economic hardship pressed on both towns and villages. Into this uneasy world stepped a child king, whose reign would come to symbolize both the grandeur and the fragility of medieval monarchy, the inheritance of a troubled crown. Charles was the son of Charles V, a monarch known as the Wise. Charles V's careful governance, his reliance on skilled administrators, and his patience in diplomacy had stabilized the kingdom. His father's legacy. In theory, the monarchy of France was absolute. In practice, a child king meant regency, and regency meant factionalism. Supporters. The royal court became not only a center of governance, but also a battlefield of influence. The revenues that should have strengthened the crown were siphoned off to fund the ambitions of great lords. Crowned in 1380 at Reims, the traditional site of French coronations, the ceremony was heavy with symbolism. Holy oil, said to have descended from heaven, was used to anoint him. Dressed in rich robes, carrying the sword of state, and crowned with gold, he was the embodiment of continuity. Charles had no power of his own. Every decision passed through his uncle's realm. Heavy taxation returned, falling most heavily on townspeople and peasants. Citizens, armed with mallets, attacked tax collectors and symbols of royal authority. It revealed the deep instability at the heart of France. Memory of the Jacquerie, the brutal peasant revolt of 1358, was still fresh. For Charles, still a teenager, these events would shape his early understanding of kingship, that the throne was not only a seat of power, but also a lightning rod for discontent. The young king takes power by 1388. Charles VI was 20 years old and declared of age to rule in his own right. At first, hope blossomed. He dismissed his uncles from their positions of influence and recalled his father's old advisors, known as the Marmoset. Their guidance, the realm seemed to revive. Finances were managed more carefully. Reforms were attempted. Of his father, Charles the Wise, people began to speak of a new age of stability. But this hope would not last. The shadow of madness, the turning point, came in 1392. Himself betrayed, he turned on his own companions, killing several knights before being subdued. The attack shocked all who witnessed it. From then on, Charles's illness returned in cycles, periods of lucidity followed by terrifying bouts of madness. At times he failed to recognize his own wife and children. At other times he believed himself made of glass, terrified that he might shatter at a touch in a world where kingship was seen as divinely ordained. Such instability struck at the very core of monarchy. How could the kingdom be governed when its ruler drifted in and out of reason? The fragility of royal power. Charles's illness had consequences far beyond the royal household. Power once again slipped into the hands of his relatives, who resumed their rivalries. The Dukes of Burgundy and Orleans, in particular, vied for control, turning the royal court into a battlefield of intrigue. For the common people, the effects were devastating. Soldiers, unpaid and restless, plundered the countryside. Merchants faced uncertainty as trade routes became entangled in factional disputes. The fragile stability that Charles had briefly restored vanished. France was once again teetering. The 100 Years' War still smoldered, with England waiting for its chance to exploit French weakness. Inside the kingdom, factions sharpened their knives, preparing for decades of bloody conflict that would come to be known as the Armagnac Burgundian. With a crown cursed with an illness that made him unfit to wear it, his reign would become a study in the fragility of monarchy. Is only just beginning. We have seen his rise to the throne, the hope of his early reign, and the first signs of the illness that would define his legacy lie ahead. So one must ask, was France's fate sealed by the madness of its king? When Charles VI's illness first appeared in 1392, his court hoped it was an isolated event. Medieval medicine often explained madness as a passing imbalance of humors, a condition that could be corrected with rest, prayer, or herbal remedies. But as the years wore on, it became clear that the king's condition was permanent. At intervals, Charles would recover his senses. In these lucid moments, he could speak, listen, and even make decisions like any other ruler. Yet, just as suddenly, the shadows returned. He became violent, paranoid, or withdrawn. Courtiers whispered of strange delusions, that he believed he was made of glass and might shatter if touched, or that he forgot entirely that he was king. The man anointed at Rheims, crowned as the chosen of God, seemed at times little more than a helpless patient in a monarchy where authority was embodied in the king's very person. Charles's instability created a vacuum. Into that vacuum rushed the ambitions of his family. The rivalry of Burgundy and Orleans too. Figures rose to dominate French politics in the late 14th and early 15th centuries. Philip the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, and Louis, Duke of Orleans, the king's younger brother, Philip the Bold, as head of the powerful Burgundian line, commanded immense wealth from the prosperous cities of Flanders. His court at Dijon rivaled Paris in splendor, and his alliance with urban merchants gave him influence across northern Europe. Louis of Orleans, meanwhile, enjoyed his proximity to the throne as the king's brother, as well as command of royal revenues. When Charles's illness struck, both men sought to position themselves as the true protector of France. Neither was content to merely govern. Each wished to dominate. At first, Philip's age and experience gave him the upper hand, but after his death in 1404, his son, John the Fearless, inherited both his titles and his ambitions. John proved no less determined to steer the crown, and his rivalry with Orleans soon escalated into open hostility. The Queen's role and the strain of court life caught between these factions was Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, married to Charles VI in 1385. She had entered the French court as a teenager. When her husband fell into madness, she was thrust into a role far beyond what most queens expected. She was expected to mediate, to preserve stability, and at times to act as regent. Isabeau, however, was not universally trusted. Foreign-born, she faced suspicion among the French nobility. Gossip at court accused her of corruption, extravagance, and even adultery, charges that reveal as much about factional propaganda as about her own conduct. Whether or not the rumors were true, they weakened her authority, making it difficult for her to hold the balance between Orleans and Burgundy. For the ordinary courtier, life became an endless calculation of loyalty. To whom should one pledge service? The king who drifted in and out of awareness, the queen who sought to mediate, the Duke of Burgundy with his armies and wealth, or the king's brother with his access to royal revenues. A misstep could mean exile or worse, murder in the streets. The rivalry between Burgundy and Orleans reached its breaking point in 1407 on a cold November evening in Paris. Louis of Orleans was set upon by assassins as he left the Queen's residence. He was brutally hacked to death in the street, his body left mutilated as a message. John the Fearless of Burgundy quickly admitted responsibility. He justified the murder as an act of tyrannicide, claiming that Louis had been a corrupting influence, draining royal revenues and plotting treason. Many in Paris, weary of taxation and unrest, applauded the act, but to others it was a shocking violation of kinship and law. A royal prince murdered by another royal duke. The consequences were dire. The Orleans family, later known as the Armagnacs, after their allies, swore vengeance. France descended into civil war, with Burgundians and Armagnacs vying for control, each claiming to act in the name of the incapacitated king. The people's Burdonnais, great lords, feuded. The people bore the weight. Taxes rose to fund private armies. Soldiers looted villages and seized supplies. Merchants in Paris and Rouen faced uncertainty as rival factions controlled trade routes and imposed competing levies. Farmers who had survived the hardships of plague and war now endured fresh devastation from their supposed protectors. In towns, allegiances shifted with the winds. A city might declare for Burgundy one year, for the Armagnacs the next, depending on who held power nearby. For artisans and apprentices, loyalty was often less a matter of principle than of survival. To wear the wrong badge on your sleeve could mean death in the street. The dream of stable monarchy, of a king who ruled above faction, seemed more distant than ever. England returns to the stage. The chaos in France did not go unnoticed across the Channel. England, long France's adversary in the 100 Years' War, had been relatively quiet during Charles VI's early reign. But in 1413, a new king ascended the English throne, Henry V. Henry was ambitious, disciplined, and eager to revive English claims to the French crown. He saw France's civil war as a perfect opportunity, with Armagnacs and Burgundians tearing one another apart. The kingdom lay vulnerable. In 1415, Henry invaded Normandy. His campaign culminated in the Battle of Agincourt, one of the most famous clashes of the Middle Ages. There, a smaller English force, aided by longbowmen, inflicted a crushing defeat on the French. Thousands of French knights and nobles were killed or captured, including many of the Armagnac faction. For Charles VI, who was in no state to command his armies, the disaster was devastating. For France, it was yet another blow, a sign that the kingdom's disunity invited foreign conquest. The Treaty of Tredah, climax of this unraveling, came in 1420 with the Treaty of Tredah, under the influence of the Burgundians, who then held power in Paris. Charles VI was persuaded to disinherit his own son, the Dauphin Charles. Instead, he recognized Henry V of England as his heir and regent of France. The treaty was nothing less than a betrayal of the Valois line. To many Frenchmen, it was unthinkable. Their king, persuaded by his queen and the Burgundians, had signed away the future of the crown to a foreigner. Yet the king's madness and the pressures of faction made resistance impossible. When Charles V affixed his seal to the treaty, France effectively ceased to be a united kingdom. It was divided between English-controlled lands, Burgundian allies, and the shrinking territories still loyal to the Dauphin, the fragile image of kingship by. Now, Charles VI was more a symbol than a ruler. He sat in Paris, tended by his household, while decisions were made around him. Courtiers remembered times when he could speak clearly and even participate in ceremonies. But increasingly, he lived in seclusion, caught between moments of lucidity and long periods of withdrawal. His presence, however, remained essential. Even in madness, he embodied the continuity of monarchy. To displace him outright would have been unthinkable, for he had been anointed with holy oil and crowned at Reims. Instead, rival factions used his name as a banner, claiming legitimacy while pursuing their own ambitions. This paradox defined late medieval France, a kingdom where the king still reigned in theory. Yet in practice, the realm was governed by competing warlords, foreign invaders, and a weary queen toward an even greater crisis by the second decade of the 15th century. France was fractured, impoverished, and humiliated. Civil war raged between Armagnac and Burgundian, while England pressed its advantage. The royal family itself was divided, with the Dauphin declared illegitimate by treaty. The French people, long accustomed to hardship, clung to what stability they could find. In villages, they sowed their fields under the watch of armed bands. In towns, they kept their heads low, avoiding the slogans of rival factions. Yet beneath this endurance lay exhaustion, a sense that the very idea of France as a united kingdom might not survive. And all the while, Charles VI remained alive, his reign dragging on into its fourth decade, a reign remembered less for governance than for disorder. His illness had become not just a personal tragedy, but a national one, shaping the destiny of an entire kingdom. The question that lingers is stark. If France was so fractured, so exhausted, how could it ever hope to recover? And from where could salvation come? Charles VI reigned for 42 years, an extraordinary length for any medieval monarch. Yet his reign is remembered less for its duration than for its calamities. When he died in 1422, France was a kingdom divided, humbled, and on the brink of collapse. The story of those final years reveals not only the personal tragedy of a king consumed by madness, but also the resilience of a people who endured through catastrophe. A king in seclusion by the 1410s, Charles's illness dominated his life. He could no longer reliably preside over councils, lead armies, or make decisions. At times he refused to bathe or change his clothes. At other times he wandered the halls of his residences, muttering to himself, refusing to recognize even his own children. His household adapted as best it could, surrounding him with attendants, physicians, and priests. Medieval medicine offered little relief. Treatments ranged from purgatives and bleeding to prayers and charms, the countryside, or the burning of certain herbs. But none of these could cure the king. Instead, courtiers simply endured his condition, seizing moments of lucidity when he might be able to sign a document or hear a petition. For the French people, the image of their king was distant. His condition was he possessed by demons. punished by God, or simply afflicted by a mysterious illness. Whatever the cause, his absence from governance was undeniable. The burden of the civil war meanwhile, the civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians continued to bleed the kingdom. Paris itself was often at the heart of the struggle. Partisans filled the streets with armed bands, while Burgundian supporters rioted in turn. In 1418, Burgundian forces stormed Paris, massacring thousands of Armagnacs. Blood flowed in the capital, and the streets echoed with cries of vengeance. Through it all, Charles VI remained a passive figurehead. His name was invoked by both sides, but he had no power to restrain them. His seal appeared on decrees, but only because others guided his hand. In practice, France was leaderless. The people of the countryside fared no better. Fields lay untended. As soldiers seized grain and livestock, villagers fled into forests or fortified towns, abandoning their homes. Chroniclers describe empty villages and ruined farms, symbols of a land exhausted by endless conflict. The rise of England, the disaster of Agincourt in 1415, and the Treaty of Troyes in 1420 had handed much of France to the English. Of England married Catherine of Valois, Charles VI's daughter. He was not merely an ally, he was proclaimed heir to the French throne, in theory. This meant that upon Charles VI's death, France and England would be united under a single crown. In practice, it meant that France's very identity as a kingdom was under threat. The Valois line, established for generations, seemed on the verge of extinction. The Dauphin Charles, disinherited by the treaty, retreated to the south, establishing a rival court at Bourges, a ruler in name only, clinging to scraps of legitimacy. For many, the question was not whether France would survive, but whether it would disappear entirely into English dominion. The unexpected messenger, and yet, out of this despair came a figure who would transform the course of the war. Joan of Arc, in 1429. A teenage peasant girl from Domremy appeared at the Dauphin's court. The English and restore the crown of France. Two hardened nobles. Her words seemed unbelievable, but to a kingdom weary of defeat and betrayal, her faith offered something rare: hope. Joan's presence electrified the Dauphin's cause. With her encouragement, French forces lifted the siege of Orleans, a victory that marked a turning point. In the 100 Years' War, for the first time in decades, the French began to believe that recovery was possible. Charles VI himself never met Joan of Arc. By the time she rose to prominence, he was nearing the end of his life, secluded and frail. Yet her actions prepared the way for his son, the Dauphin, to reclaim the legitimacy that the Treaty of Troyes had denied him. The death of the mad King Charles VI died on the 21st of October, 1422. He was 53 years old. His death was met with little ceremony, for by then the monarchy he embodied was deeply discredited. The treaty declared Henry VI of England, the infant son of Henry V and Catherine of Valois, the rightful king of France. But even as the treaty was proclaimed, the Dauphin Charles declared himself king as Charles VII. France now had two kings, one in Paris, controlled by the English and Burgundians, and one in Bourges, supported by loyalists in the south. The war that followed would last for decades, but eventually it was Charles VII, inspired by the memory of Joan of Arc, who restored the French crown. Charles VI's burial was modest, Chroniclers note the irony. A king who had reigned so long, who had borne the weight of France in his madness, was laid to rest without grandeur. To many his death was not the end of an era, but a relief, the closing of a chapter marked by suffering, the legacy of a fragile crown. What then was Charles VI's legacy? To his contemporaries, he was remembered as Le Fou, the Mad King. His illness was seen as both a personal tragedy and a national curse. Chroniclers compared his reign to a ship without a captain, tossed by storms and preyed upon by pirates. Yet his reign also revealed the deeper fragility of medieval monarchy, a system that relied so completely on the personal authority of one man had no answer when that man could not rule. The result was factionalism, civil war, and foreign conquest for the people of France. The lesson was harsh but clear. Kingship was not an unshakable foundation, but a fragile thread, easily frayed by illness, ambition, and war. Reflections across time. Looking back, it is tempting to imagine what might have been if Charles VI had remained healthy. Could France have resisted England more effectively? Could the rivalries of Burgundy and Orleans have been contained? Might the 100 Years' War have ended sooner, with less bloodshed? We cannot know. What we do know is that Charles's madness reshaped Europe. It created the conditions for England's temporary dominance, for Joan of Arc's extraordinary rise, and for the eventual reassertion of French identity under Charles VII. In the quiet of his sick room. Charles VI may have known none of this, rippled outward, shaping the destiny of nations. His reign reminds us that even the mightiest crowns rest on fragile human shoulders, and that the course of history can turn on the weakness of one man. Thus ends the reign of Charles VI, a reign of madness, division, and despair, yet also a reign that forced France to rediscover its strength in the face of collapse. The unresolved question remains: was Charles VI merely a victim of fate, or was his reign proof that monarchy itself was too fragile to withstand the burdens of human frailty? Story 3: Peter the Cruel of Castile. Brutality and betrayal in Iberia. When Peter of Castile came to the throne in 1350, he was barely 15 years old. His father, Alfonso XI, had died suddenly of the plague while besieging Gibraltar. The Black Death had swept through Iberia as it had much of Europe, killing nobles and peasants alike, disrupting trade, and shaking the faith of kingdoms. Amidst this storm, young Peter inherited one of the most contested thrones in medieval Europe. A complicated inheritance. Castile was the largest of the Iberian kingdoms, stretching across wide plains, fortified cities, and contested frontiers with both Aragon and Granada. It was wealthy in resources, yet fragile in politics. Peter's legitimacy was secure in theory. He was the only legitimate son of Alfonso XI and Maria of Portugal. But Alfonso had filled his court with bastards, most prominently the children of his mistress, Leonor de Guzman. These half-brothers, known as the Infantes of Trastamara, would grow into Peter's bitterest enemies. From the beginning, the seeds of civil war lay within the royal family itself. The nobility, too, was restless. Castilian grandees were powerful, with private armies and fortified castles. They had little desire to see a strong king curb their independence. For many of them, a young and inexperienced ruler offered opportunities to expand their own influence. The shadow of the plague timing of Peter's accession could hardly have been worse. The plague that killed his father continued to ravage towns and villages. Chroniclers describe cities where the dead were piled in carts, fields left untended, and trade routes emptied of merchants. In such a world, superstition thrived. Some saw the plague as divine punishment for sin. Others blamed outsiders, especially Jews, who were subjected to suspicion and violence across Iberia and beyond. A young king, in such a moment, was expected to offer stability and protection. But Peter's reign would bring more turmoil instead. Early rule and the influence of Maria of Portugal first. Governance fell largely into the hands of Peter's mother, Queen Maria. Proud and politically shrewd, she tried to guard her son's inheritance against the influence of Leonor de Guzman and her many children. Court factions soon split, one side loyal to Maria and Peter, the other supporting the Trastamara bastards. These rivalries soon erupted into violence. Leonor herself was seized and executed on Maria's orders in 1351, an act that shocked the court and set the tone for the brutal politics of Peter's reign. Far from settling matters, her death only hardened the resolve of her sons to overthrow Peter one day. The young king's temperament. As a teenager, Peter showed signs of the ruthlessness that would define his rule. Chroniclers disagree on his character. Some describe him as decisive and strong-willed, others as cruel and vindictive. What is clear is that he had little patience for opposition. Nobles who defied him could expect swift punishment. In some cases, he ordered executions without trial. In others, he stripped families of their estates. Supporters praised him for imposing royal authority on unruly lords. Enemies whispered that he was a tyrant who governed by fear. Castile on the world stage. Despite internal unrest, Castile remained an important player in European politics. Its ships sailed the Atlantic, trading with England and Flanders. Its armies fought both against and alongside Aragon, depending on shifting alliances, and on its southern border, the Muslim kingdom of Granada remained a constant rival and occasional partner. The papacy, too, kept a close watch on Castile. The Avignon papacy sought allies against both the Moors and the rising power of France. Peter's marriage alliances and foreign diplomacy would soon draw him into wider conflicts that reached far beyond Iberia. The reputation begins by the late 1350s. Peter had already earned his infamous epithet, El Cruel. Chroniclers recounted scenes of executions carried out in cold blood, of nobles murdered in his presence, of favorites elevated and discarded at will. Yet, not everyone agreed. In fact, in later centuries, some Spanish writers would call him El Justiciero, the just, arguing that his punishments fell mainly on corrupt nobles who sought to defy royal authority. Was he a tyrant or a reformer misunderstood by his enemies? That debate would linger long after his death, foreshadowing betrayal, but for now the stage was set. A young king with a suspicious court, half-brothers waiting in the wings, a nobility divided, and a kingdom reeling from plague. Every thread of Castile's fragile stability pulled tighter as Peter grew into manhood. Ahead lay betrayals that would shake families, murders that would stain the court, and a civil war that would pit brother against brother in one of the most brutal chapters of Iberian history. The story of Peter of Castile cannot be told without his brothers. The sons of Leonor de Guzman, born outside of wedlock but raised in wealth and privilege, grew into some of the most ambitious nobles in Iberia. Chief among them was Henry of Trastamara, who would one day become the most formidable rival Peter ever faced. Brothers. As enemies, Henry and his brothers, Fadrique, Tello, and Sancho, commanded lands, castles, and loyalty from many discontented nobles. Though bastards, they were still sons of a king, and in an age where bloodlines carried weight, their claims were far from negligible. Peter saw them as usurpers, threats to his authority and legitimacy. The brothers, in turn, painted Peter as a tyrant unfit to rule. The seeds of civil war lay in every banquet, every whispered plot, every sharp glance across the royal court. Nobles in revolt, the grandees of Castile, were quick to exploit the division. Many of them feared Peter's harsh rule, his attempts to enforce royal justice, seizing lands, punishing corruption, centralizing authority, cut deeply into their privileges. Henry and his brothers offered an alternative, a king who would share power more generously. By the late 1350s, conspiracies multiplied. Nobles defected to Henry's side, bringing their vassals with them. Local rebellions flared across the kingdom, forcing Peter to march ceaselessly from one trouble spot to another. The strain on resources and loyalty became immense. Blood in the court. Peter's response was merciless. He executed nobles suspected of plotting against him, often without trial. He had his own half-brother, Fadrique, the Order of Santiago, one of the most prestigious military orders in Iberia, summoned by Peter to Seville under the pretense of reconciliation. He was cut down by royal guards. Chroniclers say Peter himself struck the first blow. The murder shocked Christendom. Killing a noble rival was one thing. Murdering the head of a religious order in a supposedly sacred meeting was another. For Peter's enemies, it was proof of his cruelty. For his supporters, it was an act of cold necessity, eliminating a dangerous rival before he could rally more rebellion. Marriage and betrayal. Peter's personal life further complicated his reign. In 1353, he had married Blanche of Bourbon, a French princess. The union was meant to cement ties with France, a powerful ally against Aragon and against English influence in the 100 Years' War. Yet the marriage was a disaster from the start. Within days, Peter abandoned Blanche, claiming she had betrayed him. Rumors swirled. Some said she had been unfaithful, others that Peter simply despised her. Whatever the truth, he imprisoned Blanche for years, shuttling her from fortress to fortress until her death under suspicious circumstances in 1361. This scandal outraged France and the papacy, further isolating Peter diplomatically. It also gave his enemies yet another reason to call him unfit to rule. Alliance and war with Aragon. As Peter's domestic troubles deepened. But in the 1350s, it erupted into open war. The War of the Two Peters, as it became known, was a bitter struggle between the two kings, both named Peter. Battles raged across the border. At times, Peter of Castile scored victories, but the war drained his treasury and stretched his forces thin. The Trastamara brothers seized the moment. While Peter fought Aragon, they rallied support inside Castile, framing themselves as saviors. Who could end the tyranny and chaos? The Civil War erupts by the early 1360s. Open civil war had broken out. Henry of Trastamara, supported by disaffected nobles, gained ground. Peasants and towns, weary of taxation and violence, sometimes welcomed him as a liberator. Peter, however, retained loyal supporters as well. Many urban elites and segments of the middle class favored him, since his centralizing policies curbed the power of the aristocracy. The kingdom fractured, town against countryside, noble against noble, brother against brother. The fighting was savage. Castles were besieged, villages burned, prisoners executed. Chroniclers describe whole regions devastated, crops destroyed, and families displaced. The scars of this conflict would remain visible in Castile for decades. Murder of Blanche and further infamy. Peter's treatment of Blanche of Bourbon finally reached its grim conclusion. In 1361, she died in captivity, with rumors spreading that Peter had ordered her poisoned or strangled. Her death provided Henry and his allies with propaganda of the most powerful kind. Not only had Peter murdered nobles and brothers, he had murdered a queen, a daughter of France, and a symbol of dynastic alliance. France now threw its support behind Henry, while Peter found himself increasingly isolated. Turning point. Call for foreign aid. As Henry's strength grew, Peter realized he could not win this struggle alone. He looked abroad for allies. Surprisingly, he turned to England, then locked in the 100 Years' War against France. The English, eager to weaken French influence in Iberia, responded positively. The stage was set for a strange and brutal twist. English longbowmen and mercenaries marching alongside Castilian troops in a civil war that was as much about dynastic rivalry as it was about the balance of power in Europe. A kingdom on the edge. By the mid-1360s, Castile teetered on the edge of collapse. The land had been ravaged by plague, foreign wars, and now a fratricidal conflict. Villagers abandoned their homes, trade routes lay empty, and even the church struggled to maintain authority. At the center of it all stood Peter, hated by many, feared by more, but still clinging to his throne. His cruelty was undeniable, but so too was his determination. He would not give up his crown, even if it meant plunging Castile into years of bloodshed. And now, with English support on one side and French on the other, the war for Castile was about to become a stage 4. The wider conflicts of Europe. By the mid-1360s, the civil war in Castile had become entangled with the broader struggles of Europe. The 100 Years' War, raging between England and France, spilled into Iberia as both sides backed rival claimants. Peter of Castile, desperate to preserve his throne, allied with England. His half-brother Henry of Trastamara, meanwhile, secured support from France. What had begun as a family quarrel now turned into an international conflict. The English alliance. Peter's greatest stroke of fortune came when he secured the aid of Edward, the Black Prince, son of Edward III of England. The Black Prince, famed for his victories at Crécy and Poitiers, commanded respect as one of the most formidable commanders of his age. In 1367, Peter and Edward's forces met Henry's Franco-Castilian army at the Battle of Najera. The English longbowmen, feared across Europe, devastated Henry's troops. Chroniclers record that Peter was jubilant, striding through the field and ordering harsh reprisals against captured foes. Henry barely escaped with his life, fleeing into exile. For a moment, it seemed that Peter had triumphed. He regained his throne, reoccupied his castles, and restored his authority. Yet victory proved fleeting. The cost of English help. The English had not come for free. Peter had promised Edward the Black Prince enormous sums of money to fund the campaign. He pledged gold, silver, and territorial concessions. But Castile, already impoverished by years of war and plague, could not pay what was promised. The Black Prince, sickened by illness and furious at Peter's failure to deliver, withdrew his forces. Without English support, Peter once again stood alone. His cruelty and broken promises had alienated allies, both foreign and domestic. Henry, gathering strength in exile, prepared to strike back with French assistance. The return of Henry of Trastamaraine, Saint-Lô. Henry returned to Castile at the head of a French-backed army led by the seasoned mercenary captain Bertrand du Guesclin. His forces swept through Castile, gathering support as they advanced. Many towns opened their gates willingly, preferring Henry's promises to Peter's iron hand. Peter scrambled to resist, but his resources were exhausted. His cruelty had won him fear, not loyalty. Nobles who once served him now defected. Only a few diehards remained at his side as Henry closed in. The siege of Montiel. The end came at Montiel, a fortress in La Mancha where Peter was cornered in the spring of 1369. Trapped and outnumbered, he sought to negotiate. Accounts describe him attempting secret talks with Bertrand du Guesclin, offering bribes to betray Henry. But du Guesclin, loyal to his French allies and shrewd in judgment, played a double game. He lured Peter into believing he might help, while secretly arranging a deadly meeting between the two brothers. Brother against brother. On the night of March 23, 1369, Peter was brought face to face with Henry inside du Guesclin's tent. Chroniclers record the scene with grim fascination. The two brothers, once princes of the same king, now bitter enemies, locked in a desperate struggle. They grappled hand to hand, each trying to kill the other. Peter, the taller and stronger, at first gained the upper hand, forcing Henry to the ground. But du Guesclin is said to have intervened, holding Peter down long enough for Henry to recover. Henry then plunged a dagger into Peter's body, ending his life. With that single act, the reign of Peter the Cruel was finished. Aftermath. The Trastamara dynasty. Henry proclaimed himself Henry II of Castile, founding the Trastamara dynasty that would rule for generations, eventually uniting Castile with Aragon under Ferdinand and Isabella, the very monarchs who would complete the Reconquista and sponsor Columbus's voyage. Peter's reputation was sealed almost immediately. To his enemies, he was forever the Cruel, a tyrant whose murders and betrayals destroyed Castile. To a smaller group of defenders, he was the Just, a king who tried to curb the excesses of the nobility, but was defeated by treachery. Castile in ruins. The war left Castile devastated. Villages were abandoned, crops destroyed, and treasuries emptied. Trade routes took decades to recover. The scars of civil war ran deep, both in memory and in the balance of power. Henry's rule brought some stability, but the violence of the struggle lingered. The lesson was clear. Cruelty could win fear, but it could not win loyalty. Reflection. When you think of Peter the Cruel, you might wonder whether his epithet was entirely fair. Was he truly crueler than other medieval kings, many of whom ordered executions and fought bitter wars? Or was his name the product of enemies who had the last word in shaping his legacy? His story, tragic and bloody, reminds you of the fragility of power in medieval Europe. Thrones were not secured by birth alone, but by alliances, reputation, and the loyalty of those around you. Lose those, and no amount of cruelty could save you. And so, in a dark tent at Montiel, one brother's dagger ended not only a life, but an entire chapter of Castile's history. Story 4. John Lackland of England, a king without a crown's respect. When you picture the kings of England, you might think of the grandeur of Henry VIII, the heroism of Richard the Lionheart, or the long reign of Elizabeth I, but standing in sharp contrast is John, the youngest son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, destined to inherit little, a fact that earned him the derisive nickname Lackland. And yet, through a mixture of fortune, misfortune, and ruthless ambition, John ascended to the throne of England in 1199. His reign would last only 17 years, but in that short time, he managed to alienate nobles, provoke the church, lose vast territories in France, and force his kingdom into revolt. He became one of the most reviled monarchs in English history. John's birth order shaped his fate from the beginning. His elder brothers, Henry the young king, Geoffrey, and Richard, all stood before him in the line of succession. His father, Henry II, had built an empire stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, ruling England, Ireland, Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine. John, however, was given little land or responsibility. Chroniclers describe Henry II affectionately calling him Johann sein Terra John, without land, in a family of powerful and ambitious sons. John seemed destined for obscurity, but fate intervened. One by one, his elder brothers died. Henry the young king in 1183, Geoffrey in 1186, and Richard, the famed Lionheart, in 1199. The overlooked younger son suddenly inherited the most powerful crown in Western Europe. Richard's shadow, Richard the Lionheart, left John a difficult inheritance. Though celebrated as a crusader, Richard had drained the treasury to fund wars in the Holy Land and campaigns in France. He had mortgaged royal lands, taxed heavily, and sold offices to raise money. When Richard died, John faced a kingdom weary of taxation and a treasury nearly empty. At the same time, Philip II of France, an ambitious and capable king, was eager to seize lands in Normandy and beyond. John lacked his brother's charisma and military skill, leaving him vulnerable. From the outset, a dubious accession. John's path to the throne was not smooth. Arthur of Brittany, the teenage son of his late brother Geoffrey, also had a claim. Many in Brittany, Anjou, and Normandy supported Arthur, seeing him as the rightful heir. John, however, acted swiftly, securing his coronation in Westminster and gaining support from key English nobles. But in France, Philip II used the disputed succession to his advantage. He recognized Arthur as his vassal, drawing Brittany firmly into the French orbit. From the beginning, John's legitimacy was fragile, challenged both at home and abroad. John's personality, suspicious and cruel. Chroniclers paint an unflattering portrait of John's character. He was intelligent, quick-witted, and administratively capable, but also suspicious, jealous, and vindictive. Unlike Richard, who inspired loyalty even in failure, John seemed to alienate nearly everyone he encountered. He quarreled endlessly with his barons, distrusted his advisors, and lashed out at perceived enemies. He was also accused of cruelty, both petty and extreme. One notorious tale tells of how he ordered the starvation of Matilda de Braus, the wife of a rebellious noble, along with her son, leaving them to die in a dungeon. Such stories cemented his reputation as a king who ruled through fear rather than respect. Marriage and scandal. John's personal life added to his troubles. His first marriage to Isabella of Gloucester was annulled in 1200, and he married Isabella of Angoulême, girl barely 12 years old. To secure the match, John broke her earlier betrothal to Hugh of Lusignan, a powerful noble family in Poitou. The Lusignans, outraged by the insult, appealed to Philip II of France, giving the French king yet another pretext to challenge John's authority. In John's hands, even marriage became a political blunder. The loss of Normandy, the most devastating blow to John's reign, came with the loss of Normandy. In 1202, war erupted with France. John captured Arthur of Brittany under murky circumstances. Rumors soon spread that he had murdered the boy, extinguishing his rival's claim. Whether true or not, the suspicion destroyed John's reputation in France. Nobles deserted him in droves, unwilling to support a king tainted by the murder of his nephew. Philip II pressed the advantage, and by 1204, Normandy was lost to France. This was catastrophic. Normandy had been at the heart of the Anglo-Norman identity since William the Conqueror's time. Its loss weakened the crown's prestige and enraged the barons who had estates on both sides of the Channel. John would never recover from this humiliation. The weight of unpopularity. By the first decade of the 13th century, John was deeply unpopular. His wars had drained the treasury further, and his defeats made him look weak. Nobles grumbled at his taxes, merchants complained of instability, and even the church grew hostile after John quarreled with the papacy over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Yet, despite his many failures, John clung fiercely to power. He restructured royal finances, enforced strict record-keeping, and micromanaged the kingdom in ways that revealed his sharp mind, if not his political sense. But could such administrative skill outweigh the string of disasters he left behind? Or was John's very character, suspicious, harsh, and unlucky, the true source of his downfall? If John had already alienated his nobles and lost vast swaths of land to France, his quarrel with the church added yet another layer of turmoil. The spark came in 1205 with the death of Hubert Walter, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop was no ordinary appointment. It was the highest ecclesiastical office in England, carrying immense spiritual and political power. The monks of Canterbury elected their own candidate. But John put forward another man, while Pope Innocent III supported Stephen Langton, a respected scholar and cleric. John refused to accept Langton. He saw the papal choice as interference in his kingdom, a challenge to his authority over English appointments, interdict and excommunication. The Pope responded with one of the most severe punishments in the Church's arsenal, an interdict. Beginning in 1208, the sacraments were suspended across England. Churches were closed, bells were silenced, marriages went unblessed, and the dead were buried in unconsecrated ground. For a devout medieval society, this was nothing short of spiritual catastrophe. John, however, did not back down. Instead, he seized church lands and revenues, using the crisis to enrich the crown. His defiance grew bolder until, in 1209, Innocent III excommunicated him personally. To be excommunicated was to be cut off from the body of Christendom, a stain on the soul and a political liability. Still, John resisted, confident in his control over England's resources. But as tensions with France escalated, the danger of facing both papal wrath and foreign invasion became clear. Submission to the Pope by 1213. With Philip II of France preparing an invasion, John capitulated. He made peace with Innocent III, accepting Stephen Langton as archbishop, and even going further, he surrendered England as a papal fief, placing his crown under the suzerainty of Rome. For an English king to do this was unprecedented. In exchange for papal protection, John swore fealty to the Pope and agreed to pay an annual tribute. While it solved his immediate crisis, shielding him from French attack, it enraged many of his barons, who saw it as humiliating and dishonorable. A heavy hand on the nobility at the same time, John's demands on his barons grew unbearable. Determined to reclaim lost lands in France, he levied heavy taxes, extracted scutage payments in place of military service, and fined nobles for even minor infractions. Royal justice became a tool of extortion rather than fairness. One chronicler noted that John sought out every excuse, however slight, to fleece his people. Nobles who once tolerated his rule now saw him as a predator, draining their wealth to fund hopeless wars. The failed campaign in France in 1214, John launched a grand campaign to reclaim Normandy, allying with Emperor Otto IV and the Counts of Flanders and Boulogne. It was an ambitious coalition, but at the Battle of Bouvines, the French king Philip II crushed the Allies. John's forces, fighting separately in Poitou, achieved little. The campaign collapsed, and with it went John's last serious hope of regaining the Angevin Empire. The defeat at Bouvines destroyed his credibility. To the barons, he was not only cruel and greedy, but incompetent in war. The worst of all combinations for a medieval king. The road to rebellion. By 1215, John's barons had had enough. A group of them, many from the north, began open rebellion. They marched under arms, demanding reforms to curb the king's abuses. John at first resisted, but soon realized he could not fight them all at once. The rebels marched on London, which opened its gates to them, a devastating blow. Faced with overwhelming opposition, John agreed to negotiate Magna Carta at Runnymede, June 1215. On the meadows of Runnymede, beside the River Thames, John affixed his seal to a document that would echo through history. Magna Carta. The charter laid out demands for the protection of baronial rights, limitations on royal taxation, and the promise that no free man would be imprisoned or punished without lawful judgment, the seed of what would become due process of law. For the barons, Magna Carta was a safeguard against tyranny. For John, it was a humiliation forced upon him at sword point. He never intended to honor it. Rejection and war within weeks, John appealed to the Pope, claiming he had signed under duress. Innocent III annulled Magna Carta, declaring it null and void. John gathered mercenaries and prepared to crush his barons by force. The realm descended into civil war, known as the First Barons' War. Rebels invited Prince Louis of France, son of Philip II, to invade and take the English crown. England itself became a battlefield, torn between loyalty to John and resistance to his rule. A kingdom in peril. By the autumn of 1215, John was at war on every front, against his barons, against French invaders, and against the legacy of his own failures. He moved ceaselessly across the kingdom, besieging castles, burning rebel strongholds, and seizing hostages. Yet his efforts were frantic rather than effective, and his health began to falter. The king who had once styled himself as the restorer of his father's empire now stood as a ruler whose crown rested on the edge of collapse. But how would this final act play out? Would John crush his rebellious barons and reassert royal power, or would his reign end in disgrace and defeat? By 1216, John was no longer the powerful monarch who had once tried to hold together his father's empire. His authority had left him a king in name more than in substance. England itself seemed to be slipping away. Not crowned, Louis acted as though he were already England's monarch. For John, the humiliation was almost complete. His own nobles had chosen a French prince over him. The brutality of civil war, the conflict of 1215 to 1216, was brutal, even by medieval standards. John's armies stormed castles, executed rebels, and ravaged lands belonging to those who opposed him. The violence was not random, it was deliberate punishment. Nobles who might have returned to the royal cause instead saw John as a tyrant unworthy of loyalty. Even some of his own mercenaries grew restless, unpaid, and weary of endless campaigns. Disaster at the Washeen, October 1216. John suffered one of the strangest and most symbolic misfortunes of his reign. While traveling across the marshy estuary known as the Wash in eastern England, part of his baggage train was caught by the rising tide. Carts laden with royal treasure, gold, silver, jewels, and even the crown jewels themselves sank into the quicksand and mud, lost forever. Chroniclers seized on the episode as a metaphor. The greedy king, who had squeezed every penny from his subjects, lost it all to the sea. Whether exaggerated or not, the story became a defining image of John's reign. The king's final illness soon after the disaster, John's health declined sharply. Some sources suggest he ate a meal of peaches and cider that left him with dysentery. Others imply it was the fatigue of years of campaigning and constant stress. Whatever the cause, the once restless king grew weak. He was carried from place to place, still attempting to oversee military operations, even as his body failed him. On the night of October 18th to 19th, 1216, John died at Newark Castle, attended by a small group of loyalists. He was 49 years old, a kingdom at the brink. At his death, England stood on the edge of foreign conquest. Prince Louis controlled much of the southeast, while rebel barons remained defiant that the Plantagenet dynasty would end with John replaced by a Capetian prince from across the Channel. But fate had one more twist. John's heir was his 9-year-old son, Henry, led by William Marshal, one of the most respected knights of the age, quickly rallied loyalists around the child king. Magna Carta revived William. Marshal reissued Magna Carta, this time as a gesture of conciliation rather than submission. Stripped of some of its more radical clauses, it became a promise of just rule and lawful governance under Henry III. With the Pope's blessing and Marshal's leadership, from England, defeated not by John's strength, but by the resilience of those who followed him. John had failed, but in his failure, a new political settlement emerged. John's reputation in the centuries that followed, John's reputation only darkened. Chroniclers painted him as cruel, avaricious, and cowardly. They recounted tales of his lust, his betrayal of allies, and his treachery toward his own family. Matthew Paris, a 13th century monk, declared that hell itself is made fouler by the presence of John. Even Shakespeare, writing centuries later, portrayed John as weak and deceitful, a man who brought ruin upon his kingdom. Few kings in English history have been so universally despised. The shadow of Magna Carta, and yet, despite his failings, or perhaps because of them, John left behind a legacy greater than any triumph he might have hoped for. Magna Carta, born of his tyranny, became a cornerstone of English law, cited in struggles for constitutional government for centuries too. The irony is sharp. The most hated king of England. His reign, disastrous as it was, forced the kingdom to confront the limits of royal authority. Reflection as you think of John Lackland, greed and cruelty. His story is not one of glory, but of loss. The lands of Normandy, the loyalty of his barons, the treasure at the Wash, and even the affection of his own people. And yet, in the ashes of his reign, England found a path toward a more balanced monarchy, where kings could no longer rule without restraint. The memory of John's failures became a cautionary tale, a reminder that power, when abused, carries within it the seeds of its own undoing. So the question lingers, without John's failures, would Magna Carta ever have been born? And would the idea of limited monarchy have taken root at all? After the first fits of madness in 1392, Charles VI's ability to govern was shattered. For stretches of time, he could not speak coherently or recognize those around him. Sometimes he raved violently. Other times he withdrew into silence. In his absence, his uncles reclaimed the power they had lost when Charles came of age. Philip the Bold of Burgundy, in particular, saw opportunity. As Duke of Burgundy, he controlled one of the wealthiest territories in Europe. Now, as virtual ruler of France, he extended his influence far beyond his duchy. The marmosets, the loyal advisors Charles had once elevated, were swept aside. The reforms they had begun collapsed. Corruption returned with new vigor. The people, who had briefly tasted competent governance, watched in despair as the old abuses resumed. Queen Isabeau's role-in theory. The Queen Isabeau of Bavaria could act as regent during her husband's illness. In practice, she became enmeshed in the power struggles of the court. Intelligent and pragmatic, Isabeau sought alliances that would protect her children's inheritance, but her shifting loyalties earned her suspicion. At times, she supported the Burgundians. At other moments, she leaned toward her brother-in-law, Louis of Orleans. Chroniclers, many hostile to her foreign origins, painted her as immoral and extravagant. Whispered rumors claimed she was unfaithful. Even with Louis himself, a scandal that blackened her reputation for centuries. For ordinary Parisians, she became a symbol of excess. The queen who feasted while the city starved, who dressed in silks while taxes climbed. The Duke of Orleans, Louis, Duke of Orleans, was Charles VI's younger brother and one of the most ambitious figures of the age. Handsome, charismatic, and cultured, he wielded considerable influence during the king's illness. But his lavish spending and alleged relationship with Queen Isabeau made him deeply unpopular. Louis's ambition, brought him into direct conflict with Philip of Burgundy. The two men vied for dominance, each gathering factions of nobles, clerics, and urban supporters. France was no longer ruled by a king, but by rival courts maneuvering for power in the name of a monarch who could not rule. A kingdom divided, the factional conflict soon spilled into the streets. Burgundy controlled much of northern France, and the wealthy cities along the Rhine, Orleans, gathered support in central France and among certain intellectual and clerical circles in Paris. Taxes were raised not for the war with England, but to fuel the rivalry between Burgundy and Orleans. Public trust in the monarchy crumbled further. The memory of Charles V's stability felt like a distant dream. The people of Paris, increasingly drawn to the Burgundian cause, saw in Philip a pragmatic ruler who could keep order. Orleans, by contrast, was accused of recklessness, greed, and occult practices. Propaganda painted him as a sorcerer who sought to control the king through magic. Assassination in the streets on November 23, 1407. The rivalry reached a deadly climax. As Louis of Orleans left a dinner in Paris, he was ambushed by assassins loyal to John the Fearless, Philip's son and successor as Duke of Burgundy. Louis was hacked to death in the street, his body left mutilated. The assassination shocked France, but John the Fearless did not deny it. Instead, he justified the killing as tyrannicide, the removal of a corrupt and dangerous influence over the king. Many Parisians agreed, cheering John as a defender of the realm, but to the supporters of Orleans it was murder, plain and simple. The feud escalated into open civil war. The Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. Louis's son, Charles of Orleans, inherited his father's cause. His allies, known as the Armagnacs, vowed vengeance against Burgundy. For the next decades, France descended into one of the bitterest internal conflicts of its history, the Armagnac-Burgundian Civil War. Cities declared for one side or the other. Families were torn apart by loyalties. Violence swept across the land, compounding the devastation already caused by the ongoing 100 Years' War. All the while, Charles VI remained on the throne, sometimes lucid, sometimes lost in madness. He could sign decrees, lend legitimacy, or be paraded before the people as a symbol, but he could not rule. His kingdom was governed in his name, but against his will. England returns to the stage for England. Long defeated by Charles V, the renewed chaos in France was an opportunity. Henry V, crowned in 1413, saw a divided France as ripe for conquest. With Burgundy and Armagnac locked in civil war, he launched a campaign that culminated in one of the most famous battles of the Middle Ages, Agincourt, in 1415. The French nobility, divided and disorganized, suffered a crushing defeat. Thousands of knights were captured or slain. The humiliation deepened the fracture within France, with each faction blaming the other for the disaster. Charles VI himself, unable to comprehend the full scale of the loss, drifted in and out of awareness. Chroniclers suggest he sometimes believed himself to be an ordinary peasant, wandering the palace in confusion while his kingdom crumbled. A puppet king by the late 1410s, Charles VI was little more than a figurehead. John the Fearless of Burgundy held Paris, while the Armagnacs controlled the royal family and the southern territories. Isabeau, navigating between factions, made decisions less as a queen consort and more as a political broker. To many, it seemed that the monarchy itself had become meaningless. France had kingship without kingship, a throne occupied, but not truly ruled. The paradox of Charles VI's reign lay in this contradiction. His very presence maintained continuity, but his madness ensured instability. He was both indispensable and irrelevant, a reminder of authority without the substance of it. By now, the story of Charles VI has shifted from promise to tragedy. A once beloved youth became the center of factional manipulation. His illness, the stage upon which Burgundy and Orleans tore France apart. And yet the worst was still to come, when his madness and his queen's desperation would open the gates of France itself to an English king. Story 6. Wenceslaus IV of Bohemia, the king who slept through his duties, promising inheritance. When Wenceslaus IV was born in 1361, he entered a world of glittering prestige. He was the son of Charles IV, Holy Roman Emperor, one of the most powerful rulers of the Middle Ages. Charles IV was not just any monarch. He was a statesman who had secured Bohemia's prosperity, reformed imperial governance, and made Prague a jewel of Europe. For his young heir, the path seemed radiant. Educated at the splendid Prague court, surrounded by art, learning, and political cunning, Wenceslaus was groomed to inherit a flourishing realm. His father even secured him the crown of King of the Romans at the age of just 2, ensuring his authority within the Holy Roman Empire. By all appearances, Wenceslaus's future would be one of greatness. But the boy who was meant to continue his father's legacy would instead become infamous for neglect, indulgence, and political disaster. A king, too soon, Charles IV, died in 1378, leaving Wenceslaus as both King of Bohemia and King of the Romans. At the age of 17, though young monarchs were not unusual in medieval Europe, what mattered was whether they had the will and skill to govern. Wenceslaus, however, preferred the comforts of hunting, feasting, and private retreat over the grueling labor of ruling. His court became known less for policy and more for leisure. While his father had labored to knit together the fragile empire, Wenceslaus withdrew from responsibility. The chroniclers of his reign often remarked that he simply did not like to work. Even his allies admitted that he had little taste for councils, negotiations, or the endless petitions of nobles. Instead, he left matters to favorites and indulged in pursuits that seemed unworthy of a king. The neglect of the empire, the Holy Roman Empire, sprawling across Germany, Italy, and Central Europe, required careful mediation to hold together. Local princes jealously guarded their rights, and only a skilled emperor could keep their rivalries from flaring into open conflict. Wenceslaus proved unequal to the task. He rarely attended imperial diets, the great assemblies where disputes were settled. He neglected to travel through the empire to secure loyalty. He failed to arbitrate disputes among princes, leaving quarrels to fester. In Germany, disorders spread. Robber barons preyed on merchants. Rival lords fought private wars unchecked. Without an active emperor, the very idea of imperial authority began to crumble. A kingdom in his hands and slipping a waven in his native Bohemia, where he should have been strongest. Wenceslaus faced growing opposition. The kingdom had flourished under Charles IV's careful hand, But now nobles began to complain of misrule. Wenceslaus's habit of granting favor to certain courtiers alienated. His failure to enforce justice led to resentment among towns and peasants alike. While he could show flashes of decisiveness, harshly punishing rebels or rewarding allies, his general negligence eroded respect. Prague, once the shining capital of Charles IV's empire, began to lose its luster. The institutions built by his father weakened without steady guidance. The crown itself seemed less a symbol of strength and more a relic resting on a distracted head. The shadow of Hussite dissent. Tensions also began to stir during Wenceslaus's reign. In Prague, preachers like Jan Hus began to criticize the wealth and corruption of the church. While these voices had not yet erupted into open revolt, they reflected a deep unease within Bohemia. A stronger ruler might have contained these tensions, balancing reform with loyalty to Rome. Wenceslaus, however, offered little direction. His passivity allowed grievances to grow unchecked. By failing to act, he laid the groundwork for the storms that would later erupt in the Hussite Wars. The early reputation of a neglectful king by the end of the 1380s, less than a decade into his reign, Wenceslaus had already gained a reputation as an idle ruler. Chroniclers mocked him as a man who preferred sleep to statecraft. German princes grumbled that he had abandoned the empire. Bohemian nobles muttered about his favoritism and inconsistency, and yet he remained king, protected by his royal birth, by inertia, and by the lack of an organized opposition. His downfall would not come suddenly, but through years of accumulated neglect, as one crisis after another found him unwilling or unable to rise to the challenge. Unresolved, questioned the glittering promise of Charles IV's legacy now rested in the hands of a monarch uninterested in ruling. How long could the empire and the kingdom of Bohemia endure under a king who seemed to prefer his hunting dogs and banquets to the burdens of a crown? By the late 1380s, the princes of the Holy Roman Empire were increasingly restless. For generations, emperors had been expected to maintain order, confirm privileges, and mediate disputes. Wenceslaus, however, had failed to fulfill these duties. The empire's roads grew unsafe as robber barons fortified castles and extorted travelers. Merchant leagues, like the Hanseatic cities, once secure under imperial protection, had to defend themselves. Petty wars erupted among dukes and bishops, as arbitration from the emperor never arrived. Princes who had tolerated Wenceslaus at first began to meet privately, sharing their frustrations. To them, it seemed the empire had no ruler at all. The image of Wenceslaus as a negligent monarch, absent from diets, preoccupied with leisure, hardened into a political liability. Meanwhile, discontent deepened in Bohemia. The local nobility accused Wenceslaus of granting too much power to his favorites, especially men of low birth, whom the nobles considered unworthy. These favorites often exploited their position, enriching themselves at the expense of others. Rebellions broke out. In 1394, a coalition of Bohemian nobles, including Wenceslaus's own cousin Jobst of Moravia, staged an uprising. They captured the king and held him prisoner. Though he was eventually released, the event revealed just how fragile his authority had become for a king. Imprisonment at the hands of his own subjects was a humiliation that could never be fully erased. It suggested weakness, instability, and vulnerability, qualities that ambitious rivals would not ignore in the empire. Wenceslaus's negligence pushed matters to a breaking point. In 1400, a group of powerful German princes declared that he was unfit to rule. They cited his failure to attend to the empire's needs, his disregard for justice, and his absence from imperial affairs. They went further still. They formally deposed him as king of the Romans. In his place, they elected Rupert of the Palatinate. For Wenceslas, it was a staggering blow. His father had secured him the Roman crown in infancy, but now it was stripped away for incompetence. He remained king of Bohemia, but the grand title of emperor-in-waiting was lost. His reign was no longer a promise of greatness, but a cautionary tale of wasted inheritance. After 1400, Wenceslas's influence dwindled sharply. While he still sat on the Bohemian throne, his role in the wider empire was gone. He made occasional gestures of defiance, refusing to acknowledge Rupert's election. But these gestures carried little weight. In truth, Wenceslas retreated further into personal indulgence. Accounts from the time describe him spending long days hunting, drinking heavily, and relying on a circle of companions, rather than engaging in governance. Chroniclers recorded episodes of erratic behavior, including bursts of violence against church officials. The contrast with his father could not have been sharper. Charles IV had been admired across Europe for wisdom and diligence. Wenceslas, by comparison, was mocked as a king who abandoned his throne for idleness and pleasure. At the same time, the religious tensions in Bohemia grew more urgent. Reform-minded preachers, most famously Jan Hus, spoke out against the wealth of the clergy and the moral failings of the church. Hus gained a wide following among ordinary people and among nobles who resented ecclesiastical power. The church, however, demanded suppression of these teachings. Wenceslas was caught in the middle. At times, he showed sympathy for Hus and reformist ideas. At others, he bowed to pressure from bishops and Rome. His indecision pleased no one. As with so many other issues, his inability to act decisively allowed tensions to escalate. The embers of reform smoldered, waiting for a spark to ignite them into open flames. The nobles of Bohemia, emboldened by the king's weakness, once again seized him in 1402. This time he was held captive in Vienna, his authority further shredded. A monarch so often imprisoned by his own subjects seemed less a ruler and more a pawn in noble feuds. Though he regained his freedom after several months, his prestige had collapsed. His rule was tolerated only because no consensus existed on a permanent replacement. But the dignity of his office was gone by the early 15th century. Wenceslas had become a king in name more than in fact, tolerated, mocked, and increasingly irrelevant. Despite his decline, the kingdom of Bohemia itself remained relatively strong. Its silver mines provided wealth, its cities were lively centers of trade, and its nobles were powerful but not yet united in revolt. Yet all of this strength depended on careful leadership, which Wenceslas could not provide. The sense that a storm was coming hung over his reign. Religious reformers grew bolder. Nobles schemed openly. The empire had cast him aside. His own authority weakened with every passing year of negligence. Bohemia was drifting toward upheaval, and Wenceslas, inattentive and weary of governance, did little to prevent it. Deposed in Germany, humiliated in Bohemia, And indifferent to the gathering storm of religious reform, Wenceslaus lingered on as a hollow king. The question that haunted his court was simple. When the inevitable crisis erupted, would he rise to the occasion at last, or would he sleep through the end of his reign as he had slept through its duties? By the early 15th century, Wenceslaus IV was a man in decline. Though still king of Bohemia, his authority was weakened, his reputation stained, and his will to govern almost extinguished. Observers described him as increasingly withdrawn, often drunk, and more interested in private diversions than the affairs of the crown. Hunting expeditions occupied his days, while councils of state were left waiting. He lashed out at times in bursts of anger, but these outbursts seemed less the actions of a ruler and more of a man unable to control his frustration. In Germany, he had already been replaced by Rupert, and after Rupert's death in 1410, the electors bypassed Wenceslaus, again choosing his half-brother Sigismund as king of the Romans. The humiliation was complete. Twice denied the imperial dignity, he became a bystander to the empire his father had once dominated. Meanwhile, in Bohemia, discontent found a new champion in Jan Hus, preaching at Bethlehem Chapel in Prague. Hus denounced the corruption of the clergy, the sale of indulgences, and the moral failings of the church hierarchy. His message drew vast crowds, ordinary townspeople, students, and even members of the lesser nobility. For many, Hus represented the frustrations of a kingdom neglected by its monarch. Where Wenceslaus had failed to act, Hus spoke boldly. The contrast was not lost on contemporaries. Wenceslaus wavered. At times, he defended Hus against church authorities, valuing his popularity. At other moments, he yielded to pressure from Rome and the higher clergy. His inconsistent stance pleased no one and only deepened divisions. By 1414, when Hus was summoned to the Council of Constance, the issue had outgrown Wenceslaus entirely. The king, indecisive and distracted, simply watched as events slipped beyond his control. In 1415, Jan Hus was burned at the stake for heresy. The news electrified Bohemia. Too many. Hus was a martyr for truth, silenced by a corrupt church. The anger was immediate and widespread. Nobles issued formal protests. Towns erupted in unrest. Ordinary people turned Hus's death into a rallying cry for reform. And Wenceslaus, he was stunned, but as so often in his reign, he failed to act decisively. He did not lead the anger into negotiation, nor did he suppress the dissent with firmness. Instead, he drifted, leaving the kingdom to seethe. His passivity in this moment was perhaps the most consequential failure of his reign, for inaction allowed the fury of Hus's supporters to harden into a movement that would soon plunge Bohemia into decades of religious war. The anger of the Hussites quickly turned against Wenceslaus himself. They accused him of failing to defend Hus, of siding with corrupt clerics, and of abandoning his own people. At the same time, the nobility continued to resent his favoritism and his erratic rule. When he attempted to mediate disputes, his reputation for negligence robbed him of credibility. What had once been quiet grumbling now became open defiance. By the final years of his reign, Wenceslaus was a king surrounded by suspicion, unable to command loyalty, and incapable of halting the rising tide of religious revolt. In August 1419, a dramatic event shook Prague. A Hussite crowd, furious with the city council, stormed the town hall and threw several councillors from the windows in the infamous First Defenestration of Prague. The shock of the event was immense. Violence had erupted openly. The old order overturned in an instant. When news of the defenestration reached Wenceslaus, it struck him like a mortal blow. Already weakened by years of indulgence and ill health, he collapsed. Some sources say from a stroke, others from sheer shock and despair. Within days, he was dead. At 58, Wenceslaus IV left behind a kingdom on the brink of civil war. His reign, marked by neglect and wasted opportunity, ended not with triumph, but with the shattering sound of bodies thrown from a window. With Wenceslaus gone, the fragile balance of Bohemia collapsed. The Hussites rose in open rebellion, determined to defend Huss's memory and reform the church by force if necessary. For 2 decades, Bohemia would be consumed by the Hussite wars, a conflict of religious conviction, noble ambition, and popular fury. Cities burned, armies marched, and the kingdom that Charles IV had built into a jewel of Europe became a battleground. And though Wenceslaus was not alive to see it, the roots of this upheaval lay firmly in his reign. Legacy of a sleeping king. How is Wenceslaus remembered? Not as a tyrant, nor as a visionary, but as something perhaps more damning for a monarch. As a king who did little. He was not cruel, nor spectacularly wicked. His reign was not one of grand projects or bold reforms. Instead, it was marked by idleness, neglect, and wasted potential. The son of one of the greatest emperors of the Middle Ages left behind only the memory of squandered inheritance. His story is a reminder that sometimes the most terrible kings are not those who commit monstrous deeds, but those who allow neglect, drift, and indecision to unravel what others had built. Final reflection: when you look back on Wenceslaus IV, you see not the brilliance of his father, but the shadow of what might have been. His idleness allowed the empire to weaken. His neglect let Bohemia's nobles defy the crown. And his indecision let religious fury boil into open war. It invites a quiet question. In history, is it worse to rule badly or to barely rule at all? Ask. You have been listening to Boring Past Times. 6 stories of the most terrible kings in medieval history, their errors, their neglect, and the quiet consequences that reshaped kingdoms. May the echoes of their crowns rest with you now in silence. Until next time, let the past keep watch as you sleep.